Yeah, okay, we're now broadcasting. So, hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I'm Christiana Ellis,
And I'm Mike McKean.
and tonight we are continuing our series on Tom Cruise, specifically his career in the 90s. I think we may talk about many of his 90s movies, but in particular, we're going to focus on A Few Good Men, Jerry Maguire. I had to think about that one for a second, and Magnolia. So,
Yes.
so Tom,
And
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, contrary to the title, Tom Cruise did not make 100 movies, and we are not watching all of them.
It's true. It's true. He did make a lot, though. You know, we talked a little bit last time about the process we used to decide which of his many movies we've done. So, like, for example, without necessarily going all the way back through it, we're not talking about the Mission Impossible movies because we have talked about those already. If people are interested, you can look back through our back catalog and see where we were doing a compare and contrast with Mission Impossible movies and James Bond. So we've
And we
done
actually
all of those already. We're not
we
doing them
watched
again.
every Mission Impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're certainly not ignoring them. They are a notable part of Tom Cruise's career. We've just talked about them already. So I feel like before we jump right into A Few Good Men, which was in 1992, you know, at this point, I feel like Tom Cruise, like having been the lead in a few movies, certainly, he was already, you know, a leading man. But I feel like the 90s is where he's full blown huge movie star, right? That's where he is not just a leading man, he is Tom Cruise, you know, above the title Tom Cruise.
Yeah, he's well, and there's a couple interesting things with what I think is happening in the 90s. Not only has he entered the space where Tom Cruise himself can carry a movie's financial success, like he
Mm-hmm.
is a movie star
Yeah.
in every sense of the word, but he's starting to find the rhythm of how to use what is unique about him
Mm-hmm.
and but play good parts, right? Like to use his skills and his
Mm-hmm.
shiny smile and his teeth. Some of the stuff we kind of knocked cocktail for,
Yeah,
abusing.
yeah.
He's figured out how to kind of lean into that and how to make that a part of the character that makes the character someone only Tom Cruise could play.
Yeah, so we'll get into this with a few good men, but I actually had the thought while watching that it seems like at least in this time period, Tom Cruise's sweet spot is preppy asshole with a slightly tarnished heart of gold.
Yes, who's
That's
incredibly
just like,
charming.
yeah,
So
yeah,
he can be kind of an asshole because people just are drawn to him.
yeah, yeah. Um, but that certainly describes his character in A Few Good Men. But yeah, so I think you're right that like that's where he starts. I would have to actually look up the detail, but I think that this is probably the time period where he starts getting involved, kind of in the producer level too, right? Like he's big enough that he can swing his weight around a little bit in that regard, and he starts being, willing to try to be more involved at that level and not just be, gun for hire, so to speak.
Yep.
Because all of his movies become by default Tom Cruise vehicles, and he's not just in a movie; he is in a large part defining what the movie is.
Yes, I would agree. So
Hmm. So one of the things that I don't think we did last time, but I think might be interesting, and let me just run it by you as just a structure here, is that we can maybe just do a step through his full career in the 90s, like all of the movies, but the ones that are not the ones we're focusing on, we can maybe just do, a minute or two on, but just kind of step through and talk about all of them, because I think one of the things that obviously we're not going to do all of them in depth, but at the same time, I think we can sometimes lose some of the texture if we don't talk about the others at all. What do you think?
yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay. Well, so in that sense, in that interest, then, his very first movie in the 90s came right on the heel of Born on the 4th of July, which was 1989.
Yep.
And it was Days of Thunder in 1990, which I mostly remember because my dad liked stock car racing and it was a stock car racing movie. and he liked it because it was a stock car racing movie, but I think it's not one that we think of as having aged particularly well.
No, it's one of those ones where you know how they make the joke about movie pitches, and it's like, oh, it's X, but in Y,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
This is, oh, it's Top Gun on the racetrack. Like
Mhm.
this literally you could see that being pitched. It has so many of the same beats
Mhm.
of just being an upstart, a renegade, the accident, and the coming to terms with it, and like, oh, I mean, just all it's ridiculous and like how much it is Top Gun on a racetrack, but it
Mhm.
doesn't do anything new or different. Like you said, it isn't memorable. It's
I think it is his first movie with Nicole Kidman, though.
it
I had
is.
forgotten that it was her as the lead until I just looked it up just now. But
Yeah,
it's
I actually had thought Far and Away was their first movie together. I had completely forgot she was the lead in this too, because
mhm.
she is somewhat forgettable.
It's funny. Well,
Notable to say, when you click on Days of Thunder on IMDb, it tries to advertise you to look at either Ford versus Ferrari or what's the Will Ferrell one? I just clicked off of it.
oh, Talladega Nights.
Talladega Nights. Those are the two movies it
I
tries to
actually
drive you to.
I
Yeah.
actually rewatched Talladega Nights in the last year. That one holds up pretty well. It's, of that era of Will Ferrell stuff, I think it's pretty good.
Yeah.
But yeah, so in any case, let's just go ahead and go to the next one on the list here is Far and Away, which I don't think I've actually seen. I don't think I've seen that one. If I
Really?
have, I remember nothing about it. Like you were just saying, I thought Far and Away was the first one, and Nicole Kidman is like, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't even know what it's about.
I enjoy Far and Away. It's about Irish immigrants
Okay.
after the potato famine or whatever in the late 1800s. So she is like more of the well-to-do landowner daughter. He is the more rough, like came over the ship and has to. He decides he learns to box to make
Mm-hmm.
money, right? And that so he's becoming even less of what her family wants him to be.
I am
And
suddenly
yeah.
like feeling weird anxiety just at the mental concept of Tom Cruise trying to do an Irish accent.
Oh, it's thick. Yeah. You should at least watch clips of it. It's not bad.
Okay. Like I'm not worried about being offended per se. It's just so contrary to like my mental picture of him. It's hard for me to even imagine.
Yeah, I don't remember it well enough, but it's not the kind of thing where I think it was a big deal at the time. Like, oh my gosh, like that was
Well, it's not like Kevin Costner in Robin Hood or something.
no, it wasn't
Okay.
that.
Okay.
Um anyway, the movie then culminates really quickly in this they are all trying to participate in the Oklahoma land rush. And
Mhm.
so there's a whole again these parallel paths of the rich, more wealthy people trying to go down it, and then how are the more common immigrants trying to get a piece of this land grab as well. And Nicole Kidman is in love with him. It's very Titanic-y in that. um but that, I mean, that's really the genesis of it. He's very good in it. He's very much it's again, it's one of these things where he's starting to find. We didn't talk too much about Born on the Fourth of July, but obviously he got
Mhm.
nominated for Best Actor there. But he's
Mhm.
he's learning how to be more serious but yet not take away from his charming,
Yeah,
use of.
like I vaguely think of Born on the 4th of July as almost like this weird anomaly in his early career because he really like when we talk about that type that he plays, the sweet spot that I was mentioning, Born on the 4th of July is like I think maybe as far away from that as he gets.
Yeah, and I think why it's important in the thing, and I didn't want to watch it because I just don't enjoy the movie that much. But I
Mm,
think that what it is it's like it like moves the Overton window of Tom Cruise, right? Like
yeah,
because he's so serious and so against type, but he learned how to do that, and then he's starting to find that he's starting to dial that in,
right,
right?
right.
So
Yeah. Well, in
anyway,
any
that's
case,
far and away. It's it's
sure.
it's worth a watch.
Yeah.
I
All right.
liked it.
Well, maybe I'll check it out. But that now brings us to 1992 and the first of the movies that we're going to focus on today, which is A Few Good Men, directed by Rob Reiner, written by David Mamet. Or no, excuse me, Aaron Sorkin. What am I thinking?
Sorkin.
Aaron
Yeah.
Sorkin. I don't even know why I said Mamet. It's David Mamet and Aaron Sorkin are not the same person. Um,
And I had forgotten until I've watched this movie a million times, but I've never, I haven't for a long time sat down and thought about watching it, right? And so this was a different experience because we're trying to take in all these pieces. I had completely forgotten Aaron Sorkin wrote this, and man, does that make sense?
There's even walk and talks.
Yes.
Lots of them.
It's a lot, Aaron Sorkin.
Yeah. So for anyone who has never seen this, or if it's been a while, the basic premise is that we have we're on it's Guantanamo, right?
Guantanamo,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's the military base in Cuba. This is set. I mean, it's set contemporaneously, right? Like it's not a period piece at that time. It's meant to be present
No,
day when it was made, right? So,
and Guantanamo was different at that point
right,
because
yeah, it wasn't
Guantanamo
really like
it wasn't the terrorist.
Mhm.
It was more of the communist
Yeah, it was
protection
still
and the
Cold War version of Guantanamo. But
yeah.
so we have the Marines stationed there. One of them's not doing so well, and then he gets ambushed in the middle of the night and beaten by some of the Marines and dies as a result. But there is just enough strangeness about the case that it makes it feel like it might need to be considered more than even just like obviously they beat him on purpose. That was not an accident. But there's a question that it seems like perhaps the rag that was put in his mouth was maybe poisoned and it was actually premeditated murder and not just manslaughter, I guess. But it's also all tied in together with the idea of these code reds, which is to say unofficial punishments that don't come officially from the chain of command but get dealt out by Marines what and so the court case comes into play because we have Demi Moore, who's the one she feels like okay. Let me just describe the plot before we get into some of the nuances of this because
Yes. So
there are
they put
nuances.
it because it is an odd case. They put a prosecutor who is known to plea deal
Mm-hmm.
and is proud of that and almost arrogant about that
Yeah.
onto the case specifically to make sure that no more questions get asked is the idea, right?
Right.
Like it's
Well,
manipulated to be that,
Well,
right?
and specifically, what we have is to like even before that
That's
happens,
something.
we have Demi Moore, who seems actually to think something's fishy here. I don't understand. Like the surface level version of this doesn't sound right to me. I want to push harder on this, and they tell her we're not going to let you be the main person on that. We're going to bring in someone else. And they tell her it's because, like, they imply that it's because she's not good enough, right? But then, so what they do is they bring in Tom Cruise's character, who, as you said, is known for getting his clients plea deals and doing it fast. And certainly, as we're introduced to him, that seems to be his vibe. Like he's practically trying to have the phone call about what the sentence is going to be before he even flies to Cuba. Right? Like, because we have also Kevin Bacon, who's going to be the prosecutor in this case, who's, there's negotiation happening there. But what it all comes down to as we develop this, the case develops, we also have Kevin Pollak as Tom Cruise's, like, partner, I guess. It's a little unclear what his official role is. I guess he's co-counsel, but it's like, I don't know. There's some of that stuff that I don't really know how it works.
Yeah.
But he's there. He's Tom Cruise's
Being more
friend.
like an aide. Yeah.
Yeah.
In a way.
But what develops over the course of this that we figure out pretty quickly is that it seems like what actually did happen here is the base commander, played by Jack Nicholson, ordered through his subordinates, ordered the men to carry out this code red, which resulted in his death. And that this story about it being a poisoning and everything, it was all actually a conspiracy about they knew he had medical issues but didn't want to, you know, put him on softer duty. And so he was falling behind in his work because he had medical issues that they were trying to ignore. And then when it killed him, they're trying to blame that as murder on the soldiers, throwing them under the bus instead of revealing that there's this whole corrupt culture within the chain of command at this base. But the problem is, even though we come to that conclusion relatively early on, it seems obvious that that's what's true. How do you prove that? And ultimately, it basically, there's a lot of back and forth, but what it all comes down to is Tom Cruise deciding to actually call Jack Nicholson's character to the stand to try to force him to confess on the basis that he does not think it was wrong. He does not want to lie about it because he's proud of it. But regardless, if we can get him to admit it, then the rest of the court is going to say, wait, actually, you are not allowed to do that. Although, I don't know, we'll talk about this somewhat. But now that that's kind of the basic plot, one of the things that I think was interesting about this movie that I kind of almost wish was explored more, but I'm glad at the very least we had Kevin Pollak's character in the movie to make this point, which is to say, okay, maybe, yeah, these guys are innocent of deliberate murder, and maybe, yes, they were given an order, but they were given a bad, evil, mean-spirited order that they should have known was illegal. Why are we pretending that these are good guys? You know, so it's like, even if we want to say the chain of command was evil and we want to uncover that, even if we want to say they didn't do the specific thing they're being accused of, that does not make them noble heroes or men of honor. And I was frankly extremely sympathetic to that position and feeling like it's a little bit weird that the movie does give a voice to that perspective, but then overall by the end does not seem convinced by it, because we have Tom Cruise and what's his name, the only guy who really talks of these two suspects, acting like, oh, well, no, it is actually an honorable thing somehow, the fact that you beat this kid to death because he couldn't run a mile fast enough.
I'd left with a different perspective.
Okay.
You know, I left with I felt like the movie truly showed that how the chain of command can take advantage of one kid who had a ton of naivety,
Mm-hmm.
and another who had a ton of pride in what he thought the Marines were.
Right.
And they abused him
Mm-hmm.
by manipulated him into thinking this was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
I did not feel like it made either of them seem noble. And the fact that they, you know, the surprise on the naive kid's face when they were dishonorably discharged,
Mm-hmm.
and the realization on the guy who had all the pride in the Marines that he had not held up to what he believed the standards was, that whether he had manipulated or not, he had not done what he should have done, right? Like, he came to that conclusion. And I think that's why Tom Cruise says that he has honor, because he learned and realized that he had made that mistake.
Yeah.
And that's what I took from it, was not that it made what they did honorable. It made him realizing that it was dishonorable and learning that lesson, what made him an honorable human.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess I can see that. I just feel like the movie does not seem able to really settle that as clearly as I would have liked, because for one example, the fact that one of these two kids is clearly barely even has the concept of what is happening, does not realize how much trouble he's in. Like you said, surprised at the end when he's dishonorably discharged. But here am I thinking, this is pretty far in the process for them to not have explained this to him. And maybe it's hard to convince him because he doesn't really know. Well, you try harder then. You don't just let him continue to think it's all going to be fine. Like, that seems bad to me.
Okay, yeah, I can see where you do that. I take that as honest, like, some of the Aaron Sorkin sort of writer liberties with it is
Mm-hmm.
that there's a rhetorical point to having him be surprised for any audience members who maybe would have been surprised. Like he's their vehicle of like,
Mm-hmm.
wait, but we went through all these machinations and we got what we wanted, but it wasn't, oh, wait, but no, this was actually a bad thing that they did. And they
Yeah.
are still in trouble for it. I felt like he's the vehicle for those audience members, not
I.
you're right. Yes, and I can see why you take that. And I'm not, so
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree with you.
Well, right.
I
I think
take it as rhetorical.
sure. I think I just sort of feel like the movie kind of wants to have, have the cake and eat it too, so to speak, with what the crime is in being actually a very serious and not okay thing. But then also kind of wanting us to be happy that these guys aren't convicted of the full crime, right? Like, but it is a very nuanced circumstance. It's like having a law. It's essentially exactly this. It is a court case movie where you say, okay, this client is a, like, just in the abstract, this client is a bad person who did bad things, but they didn't do the very specific bad thing that they're currently on trial for. And so I feel like you want to be committed to the truth, and therefore you don't want them to be convicted for something that they didn't do. But also, like, what they did, like, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's all complicated, and I appreciate that the movie is willing to give voice to the nuance. It doesn't try to pretend that's not there. But I guess I just throughout found myself on Kevin Pollak's side, which is to say, look, we're doing the right thing by defending these guys in this case. And yes, uncovering all this corruption is the right thing, but I'm not going to come out of this at the other side thinking these are good guys. And I kind of felt myself in that position most of the time, but then I think that the movie at the very end does not ultimately seem to take that position.
Right. And
And I, so it's the sort of thing where, like, yes, the one guy does say what we did wasn't right, right? And he comes to that conclusion. He's willing to accept the dishonorable discharge, which, I mean, I think in terms of criminal cases, like in the non-military, you beat someone really badly and then they die, whether you wanted them to die or not. Like, that's still something you go to jail for usually.
yeah, but I think that the piece to this is that they were ordered to do it in a place where that is not questioned.
Mm-hmm.
Like that that's that's the ultimate crime here, I think, is that they're built into a place where
Mm-hmm.
it's not like just your boss asked you to go beat up
Yeah.
somebody. Like this in their minds, because of the two people they chose, this was a non-negotiable task that they had to do because one believed in the military so much and one was too naive.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the movie is showing is that him recognizing that he, the maybe the military and this particular thing, maybe there are things that maybe he should have stood up for that kid, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and you could say, well, yeah, you should have known that before, but that's the whole point, is that he didn't know that before. And so that's where the end, in my opinion, when Tom Cruise says, like, you don't have to wear a badge to have honor, he's saying, like, hey, like, you recognizing that you guys did not, that you should have stood up for this, as hard as that would have been, that's
Mm-hmm.
honorable.
Yeah, I guess it's just sort of the, like, sort of retroactive. You know what I mean?
It's a very rhetorical movie, though. Like, I
Yeah,
keep
I
using
guess
that
so.
term, but it's designed that way on purpose because there's a lot of other things, like the fact that, yes, the whole point of Jack Nicholson wants to admit it because he doesn't think it was wrong. I
Hmm.
mean, it's still heavily manipulated. Like, that dude in real
Oh,
life, that would never have happened,
well,
right?
right.
Like,
Okay. There's two pieces that I like that I think are ultimately a little bit silly about that. A, someone in that position still knows how to keep his friggin' mouth shut. He's not going to get manipulated as easily as it happens in this movie. Because frankly, like, as big a deal as that one exchange is, I want the truth, you can't handle the truth. Like, it's actually a strangely awkward moment in the scene in full context, because it's like Tom Cruise is like half talking back to him still as it's happening. It's like, I think I'm entitled, and just like they're sort of talking over each other a little bit. It's actually a little bit of a weird moment for how sort of like cliche it is, right? But like,
But I think that's the only thing that actually gives it some realism,
yeah.
right?
Well,
Is that
I agree, but like it's trying to grant realism to something that's fundamentally not a very realistic thing happening,
right.
right? But the other thing that I think, maybe this is just me being a little bit too cynical, is even if he does admit it there on the stand, I don't think that they're literally putting him into handcuffs right there in the room as he's like struggling against the bailiffs. I don't think that happens. That's silly. That's not how that works.
No,
Besides, he's going to have 35 senators willing to testify that he should be allowed to do it.
I understand that's
Yeah.
not. But that, I guess that's kind of my point going to the rest of the movie, is that I've kind of granted the movie this
Well,
this hyper realism
yeah.
courtroom. Like, it's like taking courtroom and military dramas and just dialing them up to
Yeah.
11.
Let
just
me be clear. I
roll
like this
over the ride.
movie. I think
Yeah.
this is a good movie. I'm not trying to say it's bad. I'm mostly nitpicking things that itched me a little bit, but by and large, this is a great movie. I think. Well, I was actually really kind of. I hadn't necessarily been looking forward to it, but I put it on and I was just thinking, like 40 minutes in, it's like, wow, this movie just really moves. It just moves along. It just draws you in. It just keeps moving along. Things keep happening. Well, the one thing that I'll say is more than a nitpick, though, is all the stuff with that one officer who goes AWOL and then contacts Tom Cruise and then kills himself. What is even that? What is any of that? That should all have been cut out of the movie. None of that makes any sense.
I disagree with that. I think
Okay.
I feel like that gives the weight and the seriousness to how this chain of command and how hard it is to stand up to these people. Because you have a guy who is that high in the chain of command, who he himself cannot protect these guys, and he knows it was wrong. He knew it was wrong. I feel like it's giving like dramatic weight to how big this machine of the Marine Corps on Gitmo is. And it, without that, I don't, some of the, so it's kind of funny that like some of my other arguments of like where we slightly differ are because I think this gives the weight that needs, right? So if you're dismissing this part, then that's part of it. Yeah.
See, I guess I think it just like that whole subplot feels to me at odds with the tone of the rest of the movie, which is courtroom drama, right? And procedural. That feels like it belongs in film noir or thriller.
That's fair. Yeah, I could see it. It does definitely feel off kilter, and I feel like it's on purpose to. Again, it gives. That piece is what gives like I said, I can't keep saying it. I don't really know another way to say it. Like, the weight to like, this is something that even the second in command, who knew this was wrong, who knew they killed this kid, and he didn't even know how to deal with it, to the point where he could never even reconcile. Once he told somebody, he could not deal with it anymore. Like to the point where he killed himself, right? Like,
right.
That's how serious what they're doing.
I mean, I guess I can see what you're saying.
And it
But
feels
yeah.
interesting that it's stilted to the rest of the movie, right? Like,
right. Well, but like I guess that stilted element, like what I'm talking about is you could almost literally just remove all of those scenes from the edit without changing anything else, and the rest of the plot would be the same.
I agree with you there, that the way the plot ticks along would be the same.
Right.
Emotionally, I don't think that the movie, for me, hits the same way without that piece.
Right. It's just kind of this weird little sort of plot dead end, though, where, we think, oh, hey, maybe this guy can help us. Oh, but now he's missing. But now he's here again. But now he won't testify. But now he's dead. Oh, well, never mind. And it just like, then they're just back to where they started.
All of those things are accurate.
Yeah.
Yes, you have reduced it to accuracy. That is correct.
Yeah.
But it's showing that it's hard to stand up to these guys.
Mm,
It's showing that there is no hope of proving this. Like, you're never going to prove it. He has to admit it.
right.
He will never ever do it. Like, and you, even these little glimmers of hope, and it almost like gives the Tom Cruise and his team like a little bit of hope, like, oh, maybe we can do it without having to do the hard part.
Yeah.
And then when all of a sudden it happens, and that's where the whole, like, and I think some of those scenes don't, I mean, some of the scenes there with him and Demi Moore and Kevin Pollak, where they're trying to decide how they're going to put this back together, those don't exist if this plot line doesn't exist. And some of those are some of my favorite ones, like when, he's basically given up because this was how he was going to get out of it. And Demi Moore is now like, no, wait, I actually believe in you. And then he goes and sees Kevin Pollak. And one of my favorite scenes in the movie that Kevin Pollak delivers is he goes, well, would you do it? And he goes, no, I would never do it.
Yeah.
But let me tell you this.
I'll give you that.
Would my father do it? No, your father would not do it. But let me tell you something. Neither your father nor me are lead counsel for these guys.
Right. Yeah.
And you should have seen yourself out there, right? Like,
so
none of that happens with
okay,
this.
I'll grant you that's a great sequence. I think you're right that perhaps in this context, having him present sort of a possibility of hope of an easy way to proceed, only to then have it suddenly all fall apart, gives Tom Cruise his great all is lost moment, right? Like, so I can see from story mechanic point of view, I can see that. I think maybe it's less, maybe part of what I'm just reacting to is, again, almost some of the same stuff that I was just talking about earlier in terms of the nuance is, I feel like I can't get on board with what this movie actually thinks about this guy. What are we supposed to think of him? Because, like, we have a whole sequence where he dresses himself up in his dress uniform before he kills himself, and it's such an emotion, it's like a loaded imagery of it at the same time that I'm feeling like, am I supposed to be sad? Am I supposed to only be upset about the impact of the case? Am I supposed to feel sorry for him? Am I supposed to loathe him for taking himself out of this case? I don't know what I'm supposed to be feeling about this guy.
I think the complexity is the point. It's because this movie isn't trying to say like all Marines are bad or the Marine Corps is bad, or
it almost says that.
but I think some of these things are some of the nuances to it of like, well, there's a lot of pride in a lot of things that they do, and they do a lot of good things, but but that's the complexity, and that's where Jack Nicholson embodies, with some of these famous speech points, right? Of like, you want me on that wall.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, honestly,
this is what y'all wanted.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that like you can't, like, I hadn't gotten into it yet, but like the thing that you cannot possibly ignore watching this movie today is the parallels with modern policing. Right? Just the idea of like, in principle, these guys are our defense for a threat. But the system also seems pretty fundamentally corrupt and broken in a number of ways that it's not clear if they're at all fixable. So you end up with this situation where, like, anytime you want to try to fix any of those problems, they just say, oh yeah, you think you could get along without us? And it's like,
so then imagine a high-ranking cop right now, struggling with trying to expose some corruption, being proud of why he originally became a cop, and just the complexities of that. Like you said, I don't know what we're supposed to. I don't know that we're supposed to feel sorry for him. I think he was proud to be a Marine at one point. He's not proud of some of the things that they've done, but he doesn't know how to get out of it. Right?
I feel like the movie doesn't know who that guy is. He's a plot mechanic. He is designed to produce a plot situation. I don't feel like the movie even knows what's really going on in his head.
I would agree with that, but again, we've discussed that a lot of the writing in this movie is meant to elicit certain things, and I think the emotions that he generates of I'm not sure how we're supposed to feel about him, I think that is by design, but not because it's of who he is, right? Like, it's just what happens to this type of person in this situation, right? Like he's very much a, like creation, like
I
persona,
think,
right?
it all actually just raises to me a question I saw being debated on a film Discord recently that was just talking about how there are some people, when criticizing whatever movie it is that they don't like, will buck at the idea that something is emotionally manipulative in a movie. And the discussion was primarily along the lines of like, well, that's a silly thing to complain about. What do you think movies are? Right? They're like machines designed to produce emotional reactions in people. Of course, they're manipulative in that sense. But the key to it all comes down to me to a phrase actually that comes out of my day job, which is just the idea of saying you can't only go by what the result is. You want the process to be under control, right? And this comes down to like how you do quality control and validation in something in any complex process, right? It's not only about saying, well, at the end you check it and if it looks okay, then everything was fine. You also want to say, but is the actual system under control? Like, do you have a controlled process, right? And just because you succeed, you got a good result this time, if your process is not control, you can't be confident that it's going to be good the next time and the time after that and the time after that, etc. Right? And so even though movies are not quite the same there, obviously, what this feels like, that whole subplot feels to me like it's not a controlled process. The result that we want is that great sequence where Tom Cruise gets his all is lost moment, and then Kevin Pollak talks him back, into it. I agree that scene is great, and getting to that point was clearly like that was the design, but it just feels a little bit like how it got there did not feel like a controlled process. I guess that's what I'm talking about. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I completely understand like your position on it, and yeah, and I'm
Give me
not.
just a moment. I'm just stepping away from camera to turn on another light. You can keep talking. You should keep talking.
I will keep talking. So yeah, no, I 100% agree with what you're saying. It's not. I'm not going to argue the points of that. I feel differently about it,
Sure.
but not to a point where I have any kind of new argument that's going to convince, because how you have settled on is correct, right? And I see it a little different
Yeah.
because
Well,
I feel like I feel like the way it juxtaposes against the rest of the movie does work, but I also see why for you it didn't work, and it doesn't mean I'm right or you're
right.
wrong.
Yeah. So, like, yeah, that comes down to a lot of how movies tend to be subjective. Is that there are plenty of times where someone's complaining about something in a movie, and you say, "I hear what you're saying, but it didn't bother me." Right. And that happens all the time. So, but in this case, uh, I will say, like, in the context of a movie that I think is quite good and very entertaining, and people should watch it, those parts bugged me a little bit. But so now that we've kind of talked sort of through like plot, etc., certainly we can talk a little bit about performances in general, but then certainly also we're here to talk about Tom Cruise. So, go ahead.
I was about to say he hits that character that you discussed
Mm-hmm.
earlier. He is the preppy sort of an asshole
Yeah.
that is very charming. But that's what makes him work for like why they chose him, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
he's kind of got this axe to grind with the Naval Academy and the law, and like
Yeah.
he's sort of dismissive of it, which we kind of learn. Obviously, there's some stuff with his dad or whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't ultimately doesn't matter that part, right? Like
Yeah.
he's a guy who is proud of the fact that he can get people off really quickly and then go play softball
Yeah.
with the guys that he just made deals with, and that seems to be okay for him. Like that's
Right.
a life that he's happy with, you know.
I think that, there's obviously a long history of movies about a protagonist like this one who has some sort of a flaw, but then they come to an epiphany about it over the course of the movie, and then they're changed and better moving forward, right? But I think it's rare that you have that epiphany so perfectly coincide with a pivot point in the plot as well. Like not just the character arc, but the plot. Because one of the things that really gets him to the point where he understands what's happening better is when he realizes, why did they bring me into this case? They brought me in because I have a reputation for making everybody do a plea deal fast. They put me on this case because they wanted it to go away. And for him to have that recognition simultaneously of that's evidence of the conspiracy, but also it can't help but make him think a little bit negatively of his career to date, right? Like I'm the guy that they just throw cases away for, too, so that they go away. Like that can't feel good.
No, and that's that. Yeah, it's great, and then it's the two supporting cast members who kind of bring him through that between Demi Moore and Kevin Pollak. I mean, it's artful how the writing and his transition through all of it works, and to the point where you know I, I feel like one of the most uncomfortable scenes, we've sort of touched on it, but when he goes after Demi Moore, like where all of a sudden the guy who's got like the smart little quips, when they turn into like biting, nasty things to say, like that is ugly. Like
Yeah.
you don't like him in that moment.
No.
And it takes everything for her to take what you just saw as the nastiest he could be to go and get him back, right? And like that moment only works because of the funny sarcasm. So, when the whole like does hold the game show thing and it's like, no, we're gonna take the advice of the colossally stupid, it's just ugly,
Yeah.
right? But it's still the same style of his smartass jokes. And the way he kind of plays that, and then the way that we buy into her saying, you know what, that was the meanest thing anybody's ever said to me, but he's the right guy for this, so I got to go get him back.
Right. Well, and it's all there's an element of like he's the right guy, but then there's also kind of the piece of like there's not anyone else.
Not anyone else. Yeah.
Although I think like that's how it certainly plays, but I mean also Kevin Pollak's right there, so like he's literally supposed to be the one to take over if something goes bad with Tom Cruise, right? But in any case,
she's clearly feeling the same thing that Kevin Pollak like softly explains to him later, is that like she saw him earlier when he started like, what did he call it, like thundering away at Kendrick. Like he's like, she knew he was the guy that could get this done if it was going to get done, right?
What do you think about Demi Moore in this movie? Because I feel like my brain keeps sort of flipping a coin. Not that any of either side is that she's bad so much, is more just a matter of like does she really get much to do, or is she kind of just there to be the person that brings Tom Cruise in?
No, I think she gets a lot to do.
Well, no, like, so convince me, because like I said, my brain kind of keeps flipping on that.
So I think because Kevin Pollak says more things, that he kind of gets more credit, but I really believe that this has been set up as that like they're kind of the two people who bring him along, right? Like she comes in with this like, I don't believe you're any good.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, she's really the one that's consistent throughout of saying, no, we actually do need to do this. It is important.
Right. That I'm trying to make you do this. You're not doing what I want to do. I don't believe you're that good. Like you're clearly, like she knew before he did that he was brought in because of the plea deal thing. She's the one he has to convince.
Yeah.
That he's the right person for this. And that's why that scene is so important, is because she has been convinced to the point where he can be the nastiest he's been to anybody we've seen in the movie, and she still goes and fights for him.
I think what maybe is causing the dissonance in my head is that, you're absolutely right. She's not only the driving force for a lot of what happens in the movie. Like if not for her insistence, the rest of the plot doesn't happen. Right? The case would just get swept under the rug and nothing else happens, right? So I think you're right in that regard, but I think that there are scenes where she pushes him hard and she clearly believes in what she's doing and she takes it seriously and she's standing up to him and all that good stuff. But I think that there are also scenes where she might as well be a secretary. She's like getting them coffee and stuff. And that and that those pair with scenes where she resents being treated that way, and then there are other scenes where she just accepts it, just like that's normal and that's what should happen. And I think that's maybe just that, like, the script has her moments, but any scene that is not her scene, she's just furniture.
Yeah, and I would think that that's more of a script issue
Yeah.
than a more issue,
Yeah,
right?
no,
I
I
mean,
agree. I agree. I think that was just maybe where what my brain was trying to process in that. But I think you're right. Like, now that you say it, I agree. Like, I mean, she drives the plot ultimately. She has to drag Tom Cruise kicking and screaming into it until halfway through the movie.
yeah.
Of course, we also have Jack Nicholson, which we haven't really talked about too much, but he gets a Best Supporting Actor nomination. Doesn't win that year, but uh, I mean, I think he can maybe live with not winning in exchange for having one of the most memorable courtroom movie lines in history. Although, you know what I realized watching it is in my head, this movie was also the source of, like, I'm out of order, you're out of order, the whole damn system's out of order. But that's not this movie at all. Do you know what movie that is from?
That's
I
not
only
12
do because I
Angry Men.
looked it up, but
It's not 12 Angry Men. I don't know
no,
what it
it's
is.
not.
You know?
It's And Justice for All. It is Al Pacino who says it, and it's actually a little bit of a misquote because he says the whole courtroom is out of order, not this whole system. I think it's just one of those things where that's a memorable line that has been sort of ripped off and requoted 100,000 different times, and so that's why nobody really remembers where it originated from. Because, like, don't feel like I've ever even heard of that movie, but you've certainly heard that system you know, parodied in like 100 places.
Yeah.
But for some reason, I was remembering that as also in this movie, but obviously not. But that whole bit of, like, you can't handle the truth. I mean, that's iconic enough. Yeah, you get your Oscar nomination just for that, really.
Well, I mean, to the point we were talking about earlier, like, in order to sell the fact that this ridiculous thing even happened,
Mm-hmm.
the script and the actors have to be that good,
Yeah.
right? Like, for us to even just be able to say, okay, I'll give it to you, movie.
Mm-hmm.
He admitted it because Jack Nicholson has to act so pent up angry at these
Yeah.
snotty little guys who are coming in here picking at how he's doing things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and to the point where he just doesn't give a damn anymore and just wants to tell him,
Yeah.
you know what, guys, just yes, I did it. Get the hell off of me, and I do it again.
Yeah.
Like, the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I have to
The
believe that,
Well,
right?
and credit to both the script and to the performance that they set all of that up in the first meeting with him, when they're all having lunch down in Cuba, right?
Yeah.
Because it is the fact that even there in that conversation, when they are being nothing but completely deferential to him, he just can't help himself to like, even though they have not even said anything giving him any attitude or anything, just the fact that they are present just rubs him the wrong way. And we can certainly understand that there's probably an element there of, what they call consciousness of guilt, like, in the sense that even if he knows, or even if he truly believes that he didn't do anything wrong, he knows that he did something that they would think is wrong.
Right.
And so he's kind of judgmental and defensive of them, even as they haven't done anything to provoke that reaction, just because of what their role is. And he can't help but needle them just for that, right? So picking on Tom Cruise for wearing the white uniform, I won't say exactly what he says for obvious reasons, but just
Tom
things.
Cruise's impression of him later is hilarious.
Yeah, yeah, that it's a good impression. But yeah, so but like that ultimately is what turns the key for Tom Cruise later, is realizing I maybe can get him to say it because he wants to say it. He thinks that it's the right thing, and he's tired of having to pretend that it's not. And I think, like I said, it's maybe just my own cynicism that that everything would just immediately about face and then say, oh well, you admitted it on stand, kind of. Therefore, we're putting you in handcuffs now, sir. That, all right. But in any case, though, I think his performance is not especially nuanced or anything in this, right? Like, it's not a complicated new depth of character or anything for this guy, but Jack Nicholson is Jack Nicholson. It's an iconic line. People remember it, you know, and quote it and parody it 100,000 times today, so it's hard to question it on that level. In fact, you could kind of make an argument that he knows what movie he's in better than some of the other actors do. I don't know. Maybe that's an overstatement. I guess it's just an element of like his performance does feel a little bit like it is a different movie from the others, right? You know, everyone else is a little more nuanced than he is, but he's the villain, so I guess it's fine. It's not really even a complaint so much as just an observation that there's a difference in tone.
Yeah, I think again, he's the villain. It's meant to be that way. Like
Yeah.
he's dramatic for effect, and Jack Nicholson can definitely lean into that. So
Yeah. So, so this movie got the Best Supporting Actor nomination, as mentioned. It got a Best Picture nomination. It also was nominated for Best Sound and Best Film Editing. I'm going to just pull up really quick what won Best Picture that year. It was 1993. You know, the 1993 Oscars. Um, let's see. He lost Best Supporting Actor to Gene Hackman in Unforgiven, which I think is fair.
yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. Where's Best Picture? IMDb's Oscar listings is so weird. I don't know if they're trying to do it like in like they have it in such a weird order. Best Picture went to Unforgiven.
Oh yeah, of course.
That was a weird year. The 5 nominees that year were Unforgiven, A Few Good Men, Howard's End, Scent of a Woman, and The Crying Game. And I would say not all of those movies have aged equally.
What do you mean? Son of a Woman's still good.
I think Unforgiven winning seems like the most right element of the 5. And I think this movie's pretty good, although it doesn't necessarily feel to me like the kind of movie that would get a Best Picture nomination today. I don't know. I think it's entertaining. I like it. But I wonder.
Yeah,
Maybe it
I
would.
mean, I don't know. It would depend. Like, yeah, it's
You know what I think
very
is
stylized on purpose, and
what I think maybe is part of the issue, and this is a realization I had just recently, which is this kind of movie doesn't get made very much anymore because TV has taken over this genre.
yeah,
There are just not that many courtroom procedural movies made anymore. Used to be lots. Not many anymore, but there's plenty of them on TV.
yeah.
I mean, there's a whole TV show called Jag, which is essentially like this movie as a TV show. I've never actually watched it. I don't know if that's true. That's just my impression, having not watched it.
I don't watch it either.
Okay.
I mean,
But
there's 15 different Law and Orders. I mean,
yeah,
it's
well, and CSIs and criminal suspects and Bones and all like there's 100 of them, right? So the kind of just the point, like, and those have been around for a while, but I think that in the age of prestige television, the people who want to tell this kind of story are doing it on TV now instead of in a movie.
yeah.
But in any case, I think I don't know. Do we have anything else to say about A Few Good Men, or should we move on?
No, I'm good.
All right. So next up, we have on his filmography is The Firm, which, like, I I sort of vaguely remember that he's in, but it also like retroactively feels like a weird choice for him. I don't know. What do you think? Maybe
Really, I like I like the movie and I like him in
I
it.
okay. I think maybe what it is that when that movie came out, I had sort of a different general impression of John Grisham than I do now, which isn't necessarily to say that I liked him then and now I don't, as much as when,
You recognize he's more pulpy than.
yes, that's exactly it. It's more like it went from this is an important novel to this is the kind of novel that you buy at the airport to read on the beach.
And maybe John Grisham didn't even write it. He just gave you the story for someone
Yeah.
else to write. Is
Mm-hmm.
where it's at now.
Yeah. And so I think that maybe that's part of that reaction. I have not watched this movie in forever. I probably saw it when it was brand new and then not since then. So I don't really remember anything about it.
I've definitely run into it a couple of times. I almost watched it on HBO Max the other day because HBO is suggesting these types
Sure.
of movies to me
Yeah.
now. I liked it.
But
And
yeah,
I think that he.
like his role in it is pretty much like in A Few Good Men, except not military lawyer, right? He's up and coming business guy, right? But he's the guy who's going to try to skate by on charm until he realizes he's in over his head. That's kind of what that is, right?
No, the movies he has to make a decision between whether he wants to lean into what the firm and their mafia ties or whether he wants to stand up against them. And
Hmm.
that's his decision point in that one is do I want to fight the mafia and the mafia's lawyers, or do I want to just go
Hmm.
along with what I've been doing all along after I worked so hard because he put himself through Harvard waiting tables and like all this, and it's like he finally made it and he's got everything he wanted, but he doesn't feel right morally, right?
You know, all of that actually just makes me think of Better Call Saul, which is an incredible show if people aren't already watching that. But there was a moment in the last season where the main character was in a little bit of a similar boat. It wasn't the mafia, it was drug cartels. But there's a bit there where he had been put in a situation where he was forced to do something with a drug kingpin, but now there was a moment later where it's like he's kind of separated, but now he's kind of at his own decision point and he's trying to decide what to do. But his wife kind of puts it to him, okay, let's think about what you're actually talking about deciding here. Are you going to stand up to extremely powerful and dangerous criminals, or are you going to be a friend of the cartel?
Yeah, I mean that is the crux of this movie, and that's
Yeah.
where Tom Cruise's personality works because
Mm-hmm.
he's not getting by on his charm and good looks. Like he actually worked his ass off to come from nothing to become a great, pre-law like law graduate, right, and to
Mm-hmm.
be one of these preeminent guys and have like, and that's the whole point is he has everything he wanted,
Mm-hmm.
the firm he wanted to be with, the wife he wants, like all of this stuff, and then when he realizes they're working for the mafia, it's he has to
Mm-hmm.
make decisions,
Yeah.
and he tries to do the simple, some of the simple stuff of like, oh well, maybe if I just record some of who our clients are and all this stuff, but then it becomes to the point where he's got to be like all in or not, and
Yeah.
yeah, and he has some famous running scenes in this movie too.
Oh, well, yeah. I was just going to say, I know that we get just a little bit of running in A Few Good Men. I think there's just really one sequence where he runs a little bit um, towards the end, right when it's dealing with the AWOL guy who's going to be a witness or not. Is something around that I think is when he runs.
Yeah, I don't think the running became famous until the first Mission Impossible.
I
Like
think you're probably right.
he was running before that,
Yeah.
but it became like a thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. He does a lot of running in the first Mission Impossible.
Yes.
But we're not actually quite there yet, because next is in 1994, Interview with the Vampire, colon, The Vampire Chronicles. I was actually not aware that it had that colon part of it, but what do you know? There it is. Where he's Lestat. And that's a movie where I guess I know a lot of people have really strong opinions about, but I don't, especially. Like, I haven't seen it in a long time. I didn't really have any investment in the books. I don't know.
Yeah, it's not my thing.
I have heard people
positive
say
opinion
he's
thing.
actually really good in that, and I just sort of feel like I don't remember it well enough to say. Especially in the context of I don't know anything about the character he's playing, so I don't know what he's supposed to be like.
Yeah, and my understanding is the whole point of the movie was just to like pick the two most attractive guys of the day and make them like the vampires. Like, so maybe they did a great job. I don't know. I didn't really watch
I
it.
know we've got little baby Kirsten Dunst in that movie though. She's the little girl that gets turned into a vampire, and she's mad because now she won't ever get any older.
Yes.
Yep. All right, but then it takes a break for a little bit after that, and in 1996 we get the first Mission Impossible, which we have discussed in detail. But I think you're right. That is perhaps his really first real foray into action star, not just leading man, but action guy.
Yeah, because Top Gun's an action movie, but not this kind of action.
Yeah, it's not like fist fighting and explode and like jumping off of things and like. I will say though, you know, even that we certainly talked about it when we talked about this movie, but I still maintain that the bit where he does the red light, green light, gum, he's jumping from the train onto the helicopter, and then we finally get the cue of the. There's a big musical flair that goes into the Mission Impossible theme. I think is one of the best cinematic movie cues ever. Just like in terms of having the music just be perfect for the moment. Anyway, just gives me goosebumps every time. But the same year as Mission Impossible, 1996, is our next focus movie, Jerry Maguire. Directed by Cameron Crowe, who for a while directed a handful of really great movies that I love, and then kind of stopped doing that and started making movies that are less memorable. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on Cameron Crowe?
I think that's probably sums mine up too. Like, I really liked him for a while, and then I've sort of forgotten about him.
Yeah. So at his director credits, we got Say Anything, great. Singles, I don't think anyone really remembers that. But then you get Jerry Maguire, third movie, other than some like music videos and stuff. Almost Famous, great. Vanilla Sky, interesting.
Yeah, not a derailing your career movie, just a
right. But it's like it's complicated. Like there's some really interesting stuff there, but also you kind of come out of it going, I'm not sure what I just watched exactly.
Yeah.
But then Elizabethtown, We Bought a Zoo, Aloha. I think most like the most headlines that Aloha got was casting Emma Stone as a native Hawaiian person. Which, you know, I think he got rightfully deserved criticism for that. That seems like a silly decision. And, you know, nothing against Emma Stone personally, although, except maybe in the hindsight, she should not have accepted the role. But, you know, what are you going to do? But, yeah, like, he just, like, Almost Famous. Love that movie. Jerry Maguire, as we're going to talk about, great movie. Say Anything, great movie. And then there's the other ones that aren't as good. But, you know, that's how it goes sometimes. But let's talk about Jerry Maguire. This is a fascinating movie because it starts where most movies like this end and then spends the whole running time in uncharted territory from a romantic comedy standpoint. Right? Like it begins the movie where every other one of these movies has its climax, where he recognizes the fault in what he's been doing and he makes the big brave step, and then the girl comes along with him, and then he marches out, and it would be heroic cut to credits in 100 other movies. And yet, in this one, it is the very beginning of the movie. It is the inciting incident.
Yes.
I think that's cool.
It is very cool. And it, again, like, just so we can get to the Tom Cruise point of it,
Mm-hmm.
the reason it works is because it's Tom Cruise, because like he brings an emotional cachet with him, like, and that you believe that this guy is doing the right thing. Like, you don't need any background, right?
Yeah.
Like he's just, yeah, he's got that charm. Like, of course he's doing this, is, yeah, good for you, man. Like, and of course she would get up and go with him.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why wouldn't she? Like, he's
Well,
got the right idea. He's fighting the man, you know?
I also I love how slow motion the crumbling of his career is, because we are set up where he does this big thing in terms of he stays up all night, and in practically a fugue state he writes this ridiculous essay. I say ridiculous not because the views in it aren't right, but because he's literally writing it in like at 3 a.m. on 3 gin and tonics or something, right? You know, it's like this is, and he writes a 27-page memo that he then makes fancy copies of with a special cover and then puts it in every single employee's mailbox, which is a crazy thing to do. Like, it's one of those things where almost regardless of what the content is, you feel like people would be concerned about that behavior, almost no matter what it says. Right? Am I right? Like,
Yes.
yeah. So it's just one of those things where,
I mean, it's like, it's a fancier version of when they find the photocopy in Fight Club of his
yeah,
like rules on the photocopier. Like,
yeah.
that's
It is so but yeah, just the point is the movie knows and communicates to us he is way out there on a limb with this.
right.
And he recognizes it literally when he wakes up in the morning and is like, "Oh God, what did I do?" Hey, did those get distributed? Yeah. Oh, okay, they did. Yeah. Great. Okay, thanks. But then what's the first thing that everyone does? They applaud, and they're all smiling faces. Great, good job. You're saying the things we're thinking. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then as soon as his back is turned, how long do you give him? I give him a week, right? And then it's this slow motion thing where he starts relaxing a little bit, like maybe it's okay, maybe it's okay. But we gradually pick up slowly that it's not okay, and I just love the slow burn of that. I think that's just again, it's something this movie does that most movies don't, right?
Yep.
Um, I I just like spent this whole movie just thinking about how many major pieces of it are things that we just almost never see. Like the primary romantic relationship here is one where it's awkward to start because she's literally not only his employee but his only
Only
employee,
employee.
and their first interaction explicitly acknowledges that it's pretty inappropriate for them to be doing this at all. But also, even once that's all kind of established, having the chemistry of this primary relationship be that he actually kind of likes her little kid more than he does her.
I never said more than in my, but
Well,
yeah.
but it like
No,
that
you're
is
right.
her
Yeah.
point when she breaks up with him, right?
Yeah.
Is like, I
Right.
have this great guy and he loves my kid and he sure does like me a lot.
Yep.
And that line is just a sledgehammer of a line, right? Because it really does seem to sum up what's been going on. But the thing is, too, I think there's a little bit of, maybe not ambiguity is not the right word, but I maybe a little bit, just a teeniest pinch of The Graduate at the ending of this movie, where he does finally say, "No, I'm not going to let you break up with me. I do want to be your husband. I want you to be my wife. I want us to be together. I do love you." But I sort of feel like there's just a little bit of us remembering the power of that line and wondering what has really changed about that dynamic. And the answer is probably not anything. You know? uh, the kid is pretty great, though.
He is funny.
Jonathan Lipnicki, probably one of the greatest little kid child performances I can think of. I mean, we certainly got, Haley Joel Osment in Sixth Sense with an incredible performance, but he's, twice the age of little Jonathan Lipnicki in this movie.
Yep.
By the way, if you look up what Jonathan Lipnicki looks like now, it seems like it's, just even coming out of my mouth, it feels like one of those like spam ads that shows up at the bottom of blog posts and stuff. But, he looks different now because he's a grown up instead of 4 years old. No, technically he was 6 apparently when the movie came out. So probably, 5 when it was being shot. But he's just this incredibly cute little kid, and you could totally buy like the chemistry of all of this. Like that's what it feels like. It feels more like that his connection and affection for this little kid is so charming and sweet and feels very natural that it really, his relationship with Renee Zellweger does actually kind of feel secondary to that. It's when he starts thinking that of himself as like, wouldn't it be neat to be this little kid's dad? And part of that is that would be, Renee Zellweger, Dorothy's husband, I guess. Like, and he likes her too. It's not like he's only putting up with her, but it does just feel secondary in that sense. And I that's not a criticism at all. It is just an illustration of kind of what I'm talking about, that it's fascinating that a romantic comedy would do that, have that be the basis of the relationship.
Yeah. I mean, like to your point, I mean, it doesn't start that way, but it starts even weirder in that she's his only employee.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So like, we haven't really talked about like the plot, and I also have been talking a lot. So do you want to kind of sum up the plot?
I mean, we've covered the big stroke of the plot, which is,
the relationship part.
Yeah. So the sports agent, has a epiphany, writes the mission statement, doesn't quit with the mission statement, but ultimately is driven to the point where he needs to. Then there is some competition between the clients that he was working with, like him trying to win the clients over to his new sports agency versus his old agency trying to keep them with them. And I think it's the only client, if not the most prominent client that he keeps, is Rod Tidwell, which
Right.
is Cuba Gooding Jr. With, it's immensely popular here because he plays for the Arizona Cardinals and he was an Arizona State Sun Devil, the character. So that stuff is all over all of our video boards. And
they like the fictional Rod Tidwell?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Everyone loves the fictional Rod Tidwell around here in Phoenix.
Cuba Gooding Jr. plays him as a likable guy.
He does.
Yeah.
And there's also a famous line in this movie that he delivers in the, when they're having their discussion about whether or not he should be his agent. He just says, ultimately, like, I like you, Jerry, but you got to show me the money.
Right.
Say it, Jerry. Say it.
Well, and there's a great sequence where, as you mentioned, Jerry's kind of scrambling to try to hold on to as many of his clients as he can. And there's a bit where he's looking down at his phone and he's got like 15 calls on call waiting, and he's trying to just lock everybody down fast, but so many of them are telling him no. And then finally he's got Rod Tidwell here, Cuba Gooding Jr. It's not Cuba. It is Cuba, like the country, right? Like, I don't know why I'm suddenly second guessing that, but in any case, but Rod is demanding his attention and dragging out the conversation, right? He's like making him really kind of beg for it, right? And in fact, actually making him like scream into the phone and stuff like that. But all of this is played, and we're seeing Jerry can't help but be on this conversation and then keep looking down at his lines where he's seeing more and more of those calls are hanging up because he's taking too long. And then sure enough, as you said, Rod ends up his only client, but not at first, because at first he thinks he's got the big money guy, which is Cush, played by Jerry O'Connell, Frank Cushman.
Oh yeah.
And then Rod is his only other one. But then it turns out that Cush is actually not staying with him. And it's interesting. One of the things that like always kind of strikes me when I watch this is it is actually really kind of awful that they go behind Jerry's back and don't tell him. They let him continue working for them until the point where they get to just choose between the deal that Jerry has negotiated and the one that Bob Sugar negotiated. Like that seems to be that's their play, right? Is that they're letting the two of them both work, but Jerry not knowing that he's competing.
Right. And then making the decision the night before the draft, I think, right?
Right. Yeah. And so basically only letting him know. Like they don't even tell him. He figures it out because he's there in the hotel room with them and happens to answer the phone for them because they don't want to talk to any more reporters. So they weren't even going to tell him. He figured it out. And so like that's kind of awful. Which is not to say that the movie is trying to say anything other than that, but it always just really kind of struck me like it does him in the room of just like, that's a terrible thing to do to somebody. And yet at the same time, their explanation is something that like, how can you argue with it in the sense, it comes down to the core of what his whole mission statement was about, right? Because the dad is just saying, I'm just trying to get the best deal for my son. And Cush is just saying, I just want to play football. And, it just becomes about this idea of, do you think that that's the highest priority, or should there be a personal connection and personal loyalty, right? Because right. that's the crux of the crisis of conscience he has.
Right. Which then plays out over the rest of the movie in, there's the, I don't know, call it buddy comedy or whatever. Like there's the relationship development between him and Cuba Gooding Jr. as they kind of work through, and Cuba accuses him of not trying hard enough. He accuses Cuba of, not playing well enough on the field, but they're progressing. And there's the whole weird thing, like where he just marries Dorothy because it's like better for insurance or something. I don't remember. It was some weird thing.
Well, it was that the worry that there was the financial worry about the business not doing well enough, and she was going to take a job in another city.
That's right. So he marries her for financial security and to keep her there. And but that's what leads to the whole
And part of it too, which they actually, return back to, is he kind of doesn't even really totally ask her. He kind of says it hypothetically, and then she just goes ahead and treats that as a real question, which he doesn't oppose, but it is also just not a full-throated request. It is sort of a, what if I asked you to marry me, right? And then she talks about that later when she's breaking it off, where she's just basically saying, I don't want you to feel like you used me because I kind of did the same thing. Like I knew that you weren't into it the way that I was, but I kind of played along anyway.
Yeah. So that all leads into the big climax where Rod does actually get hurt when catching the winning touchdown that puts them in the playoffs, which we've been led to believe like the injury would be the most detrimental thing to him securing a new contract, right?
Well, because he had just decided to not take the contract he was offered, with the idea that he was going to play out his existing contract and be a free agent next year. And so if he were to get injured now, it's like the worst possible time for that to happen.
Right. So it's a phenomenal just from a writing standpoint, because his wife has left him, his client is angry with him and injured, and his whole business may go up in flames. And then we get to the point where we realize that he had already secured him the contract renewal with the Cardinals, and that he cares about him as a person and is actually concerned about his injury, not because of what it could have done with the contract, but because he doesn't want him to be injured, right? Like there's sort of that like
Well,
dynamic.
I'm interested just because what you described was a little bit different than what I thought. I thought what it was is the contract was still in doubt, and that it was only when Rod
Yes.
is able to get up and everyone's cheering for him and everyone loves him because he's just won the game that keeps them in playoff contention, and everybody's cheering for him, and it's such this big moment that there is a whole element where Tom Cruise is then, when he's able to see the owner later, he's basically able to say, you know, does the little money gesture, and it's like, okay, yeah, now I'm not going to be able to let him go after that. That was my impression.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I had
Okay.
sort of skipped to when he went to go see.
Oh,
I
right, yeah. So later
By the
when,
time that he goes to see Cuba Gooding Jr.,
yeah,
he can actually genuinely just be concerned about his injury and his personal relationship with him. Not he
hmm
had the contract secured at that point. Yeah,
right,
no,
yeah.
sorry, I did.
That's okay. I think we're just talking about two different scenes.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about the scene just like at the game still.
Oh yeah, no,
Yeah,
no, which correct.
yeah,
So, but that was also the point that like that they had been making to each other is that it won't matter if you get injured if the fans love you
hmm
and you're doing great things on the field. And then when he finally did that, then he
yeah,
was able to go to the owner and say, look, the fans love him and he got you the touchdown that got into the
yeah.
playoffs.
Well,
Yeah.
and the key contention in terms of what Jerry had been telling Rod to do, with the whole "help me, help you" scene, which maybe not quite as iconic as "Show Me the Money" or a handful of other lines in here, but it's certainly one of the top five, I think, in the movie.
Yeah.
But the whole idea here is, when I see you in your personal life, you're such a passionate, um, emotional person who's willing to just really put your heart out there. But then I don't see that on the field. What I see on the field is you being careful all the time and like mad when someone doesn't throw you the ball or when someone else isn't doing something that way you think they should do, and then you just get mad and sulky, and that's what the audience is seeing, and that's why you're not getting the attention you feel like you deserve. And so, even though I guess I'm not necessarily able to parse all of it as much, that's why the big moment of everyone's worried about him, but then he gets up and he does his dance, and he won the game, and it's like he's so clearly emotionally in the moment, is him finally doing what it was that Jerry told him to do.
Yeah.
And it works.
And it works, and
Yeah.
it's congruous with the mission statement that Jerry put out there, and it's when it all finally comes together.
hmm
And then you have probably when he goes back to go win Dorothy over, you have maybe the second most famous line in the movie
Yeah.
where he comes and he's giving her the big pitch, and she just stops him and says, "You had me at hello."
Yeah. So I have to briefly, at this moment, though, interrupt with a reference to a bit from a Patton Oswalt comedy routine, which at the risk that I'm going to go ahead and take of just doing someone else's comedy bit, Patton is talking about what kind of comedy movies he likes. And he says, I remember back when I went to see Jerry Maguire in the theater. I went to see it with my brother. And it was a nearly empty theater. And we're sitting there, and near the end, Tom Cruise begins, "We live in a cynical world." And my brother just yells at the screen, "Fuck you!" And that's my favorite kind of movie comedy, is when my brother yells "fuck you" at Tom Cruise. Jerry Maguire. Which I just couldn't help but think of that when watching the scene in question, because I think it's not a bad speech, but it's kind of funny to just like specifically respond to that line that way.
I yes, it's also what makes the scene. It's what makes the other line so famous is
hmm
because it it's so over the top and unnecessary. But he's earned the credibility, number
Yeah.
one, by being Tom Cruise, and number two, by like the whole movie being initiated by this like mission statement of his life, right? Like, and so that's how he treats every interaction now, you know, and for it to just be like, no, you don't have to mission statement me. Like, I love you. It's fine. You know,
just the fact that he came back and said hello, you know,
just the
what,
fact that you're here. Like, I'm happy to try again. Like, you don't need all of this.
Yeah. Because that really was kind of the dynamic that, you know, her breaking up with him in a lot of ways was really trying to be, I
Does he want
feel
you
like
back?
you only are doing this because you think it's what I want, and I'm trying to release you from that. But so the fact that despite being released from that, he comes back anyway is what makes her believe they can move forward. Although I think it is perhaps fair to question whether or not their relationship would actually continue to be healthy in the long term. But maybe, you know what? Not all relationships have to be perfect in that standpoint for them to be right in the moment. Right. So I think in any case, they're cute together. And so like, we haven't really talked about her, but Renee Zellweger is very fun in her role. Um, you know, she is pulled in so many different directions, of course, because she is inspired and attracted to this guy, Jerry, but also recognizes that she is someone with a young child, and she has now just quit her job that had financial security to go into business with the guy she kind of has a crush on, who's maybe having a personal crisis. Not even maybe, but definitely having a personal crisis. And we have also Bonnie Hunt as her sister, who's able to just vocalize all of those things in a great way. Like the whole running gag with her sister running the divorced women's support group out of the house that's just a good bit that I think they get a lot of comedy from. It's a great cast in general, right? Because you also got, Regina King as Rod Tidwell's wife, Marcy, and Kelly Preston as the Jerry's original girlfriend, who basically dumps him when it's clear he's having a personal crisis. I think it's actually interesting. She doesn't dump him right away, but what she dumps him for is not bouncing back fast enough, essentially.
Right.
Like, here, we're going to fix this, but then when he doesn't fix it fast enough in the way that she thinks is necessary, that's when he's a loser and she's going to quit. Jay Moore is fun too, just as the kind of the sleazy, the kind of guy who takes Jerry out to a cheesy Mexican restaurant and says, "How do you think I feel having to fire my mentor?" But yeah, this is a great movie. It's really good. It's got all of these famous lines for a reason, and like I said, it's just, I think it's amazing how unusual it feels in the genre, because it's a romantic comedy, but it just feels like it is zigging where every other movie zags, and in ways that I can't really think of any other examples.
No, one of the things that gave us a lot of hope for Cameron Crowe.
Yeah. So one thing that I thought might be interesting for you to touch on, if you feel so inclined, is you are not a sports agent, but you work in the sports industry. What do you think about this movie, like on that level?
Actually, I don't know him, but I am like familiar and have met and am connected on LinkedIn with the guy who this is based on.
Oh yeah.
Um,
I didn't even know it was based on a real guy.
Yeah, it's based on a real agent. Sorry, buddy, did I just roll over your foot?
Oh
no. From that aspect of it, it's pretty accurate. It's the whole point that it's trying to say is that there's a lot of sleazy things in this business, and that part of the business is accurate, and it's a pretty strong thing that people have been working through over the last 25, 30 years since this has been, to based not just on what he did, but like just in general, like it that business has gotten a lot cleaner to the point where it is more about like managing the best relationship for these people and not just what's the highest dollar I can get, right? Like there obviously is still some of that, like you want to get the best contract for the person that you have,
Mm-hmm.
but having the relationship, taking care of people, making sure that, you're thinking about what their family wants and all that type of stuff, like in a business that has a lot of money involved,
Mm-hmm.
is complicated. And this movie doesn't dive all the way into it, but what it does use to tell this story is accurate, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
from what I know. So
Well, it's certainly one of those things where you can imagine any mission statement in 1996 that contains the words less money in it. It's not probably going to go over super well in that type of environment.
yeah.
Um, and then, sure enough, it turns out to be difficult because all of a sudden, it's one of those things where when everybody thinks they know how it works, like you can always trust the agent to behave in this in their own best interest, which means how much money they're going to make, which is maybe not admirable, but it is reliable, right? And all of
Mhm.
a sudden, that's where he has so much trouble with the getting clients is it's so easy for Bob Sugar to start telling everyone he's having a mental breakdown. He's talking about making less money, like he's having a nervous breakdown. How do you trust someone like that?
Right, why would you want to go with a guy who's saying let's make less money?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think it's a great movie. I was really glad to rewatch it just because I don't think I would have ever chosen it to rewatch, but I really enjoyed rewatching it. Well, so just want to touch base on timing, just because we've been running longer than some of our
Yes,
recent episodes have been. But so perhaps we should go ahead and move along.
we should definitely do
Yeah.
that.
So just going a little more quickly through other movies. Uh, we, the next movie that he did after this one was a full 3 years later, doing Eyes Wide Shut, which is probably why it was 3 years later because that was Stanley
Only
Kubrick.
took 3 years to make that damn
Yeah.
movie. Yeah.
Now, Eyes Wide Shut is another one that I don't think I have watched in, like, since I saw it in the theater. I feel like it's not really remembered as anything other than sort of a weird experiment. Um, so I don't know. I haven't thought about it in a long time.
I got no interest in rewatching it. I mean, I don't have like I'm not angry with it or anything. It's just
Yeah, it just feels kind of like a misfire. Like not even on Tom Cruise's level, but more like on Kubrick's.
yeah.
Hmm.
It was
But
almost like Kubrick tried to like lean in because I mean I don't know the timing of all like when Tom Cruise like got into some of the weird stuff, but
it's a little bit further ahead still because it was actually the, when he started really having the sort of public weirdness that started tarnishing his public image a little bit. That was actually all the way during the press campaign for War of the Worlds, which is like 5 or 6 years off still.
okay.
Yeah.
But he had to still been like kind of odd,
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
like you don't just yeah. And Nicole Kidman and their relationship and like what was going on
Well,
with
right,
that.
because that was certainly part of the whole thing. Because like they're playing a married couple that's having trouble in that movie. Well, yeah. So yeah, all that was definitely in the news and on the headlines during all that stuff.
Yeah,
So
it's like, did Kubrick try to like take advantage of that? I don't know. It's just it was a weird thing. I
yeah.
don't have any interest in going back and watching it. So
But in any case, in the same year, but later that year, we get the next movie that we're going to focus on, and in the last movie of the 90's for him, which is Magnolia, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, in which he is just one part of a pretty large
ensemble.
ensemble cast. And in fact, just noticing for anyone who is able to see the poster here that we've got on screen, Tom Cruise is not even one of these forward-facing pedals on the poster. He's just hidden in the shadow near the top. You can only just kind of see him on one of the background pedals. Although it's kind of notable, I think, for his character to sort of be in shadow, so to speak. But yeah, so Magnolia is certainly a change up for his character, or for him as an actor, right? Because it's kind of fascinating. Well, I mean, we'll talk more about it in a moment, but just for him to choose a role that is certainly portraying a pretty negative image that also simultaneously feels a little bit like it's satire of his own real public persona in ways. Like, it's not one for one, obviously, but there's pieces of it there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in any case, Magnolia, I kind of talked about, I think last time, feeling a little bit of anxiety to rewatch it. And part of what that was, I think, was just that I hadn't rewatched it in a while. It's long, it's kind of intense. I had been worried somehow that it wouldn't hold up for me or something. As it happens, it held up for me just fine. It was and remains one of my all-time favorite movies. But I think where that anxiety was is just that it's really all about themes of vulnerability and the things that we do to try to protect ourselves from feeling vulnerable, and the way the world sometimes knocks those defenses away no matter what we do, and all of these sorts of things. And those feelings just really kind of rise up for me watching that movie. And I think there was an element of, like, that was the anxiety, was worry about feeling those feelings again, that sort of thing. But what I'll say, just this movie is such a perfect example for me of something that I absolutely love it, but I also 100% get why it wouldn't necessarily work for everybody.
So it doesn't work for me.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Um, and not in like a terrible way. Like I mean, I watch it
Yeah.
but I don't enjoy it,
Mm.
but I don't not enjoy it. Like, it's a weird thing. It's not like
Yeah.
those movies where I'm like, I'm not sitting there saying like, this movie sucks. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what's going on? Why are the frogs coming? Like, I'm not, I just, I don't know. It's weird.
It's,
And it's probably
yeah.
some of the feelings that you're getting that you are enjoying kind of exploring,
Mm-hmm.
that maybe I'm just like not, I don't know.
Well, right. Like, I think just some movies kind of just vibrate on such a specific frequency that, is not just going to hit everybody the same way. I think it's certainly very long. I think it could be argued that it's overlong. I think even Paul Thomas Anderson has said since that he probably wouldn't have had made it so long if he were making it today. It's just got so many different characters that it ends up being long just by virtue of having anything remotely like a complete story for all of them, right? It's like it just takes that long to tell 15 different little stories, even though each of those stories, if you tell it, like if you took any one of these characters' plots and you just did just their scenes instead of cutting between them all the time, it would be not very long. Wouldn't seem like very much happens, right? Like think about Quiz Kid Donnie Smith. He wants to get braces, but then he's kind of distracted. He gets himself fired. Then he goes, hangs out at a bar all afternoon, and then he tries to rob his former employer's store, only to be interrupted by frogs. Right?
Yes.
Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
yes.
So, I mean, like, there's not a lot that happens. It's mostly just dialogue in between. I think it's a very talky movie. Um, and again, I think it's also just, it's intense, and perhaps I would imagine it could be seen as overwrought. I don't want to put words in your mouth. These are just things that, like, I can watch the movie and see those pieces in it, those aspects of it, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I was trying to think about that. Because I mean, I've watched movies that are overwrought. I watch things that
Mm-hmm.
move me emotionally, and I love them. I just, whatever the is with this movie, it's just like, it's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But and I think that's where the 3 hours like throws me,
Mm-hmm.
is that because I think the movie's fine. I don't I you've kept me an hour longer than I wanted to be here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Eh,
Well, yeah, like if you're not engaged with it, you're kind of just waiting for it to be over, and it's taking a long time to do that.
Yeah, and I wonder if if it did wrap up. I don't know. It's complicated because people criticize movies that like I'm not. I know this is sort of it's like the all polar opposite, but like a Love Actually, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's trying to tell 15 stories in an hour and a half, and so they're all very trite,
Yeah.
right?
Well, right.
But there's some fun pacing to that,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
and there's a challenge to that too of like
Oh, absolutely, right? Like, because the thing is, on the one hand, it's telling a whole bunch of different stories, and so it's taking time to do that. But it's also not in a hurry to tell those stories. There are plenty of sequences where things are just like a dialogue scene is going on for a while, and certainly like it's because it's doing something with that scene, but it's not just all plot, 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 right? There's a lot of just sitting in the moment, letting things hang in the air, or just scenes where like long scenes of kind of someone kind of periodic lines of someone you know I'm thinking of the line where the one guy, the assistant to TJ Mackey, is on the phone and he's only just periodically responding as he goes up the elevator and down the hallway, and like there's a lot of stuff where like there's no plot happening there, it's all still just atmosphere.
yeah.
And so I think there is a lot of that too, right? Like, the reason that Love Actually doesn't play, like, it's doing a lot, it's kind of frenetic, but it's also like, it doesn't feel slow the way this one can. Now, I kind of like what this one is doing. Like, it's certainly a movie that even I who love it have to really be in the mood for, and I'm not always, which is exactly why I had gone so long without rewatching it. Um, but I feel like the combination and of all of these different stories and what's happening in them. So, like, just to back up a little bit, someone recently asked me, "Oh, Magnolia, what's that about?" And I kind of stopped for a moment because I'm realizing, like, how do you, like, the only thing you can even really say is it's about a bunch of different people in Los Angeles and kind of the connections that they have with each other over a 24-hour period. Like, that's all you can really say, because then otherwise you start having to get into the individual plots and the whole idea of describing the movie just kind of falls to pieces. But yeah, I mean, so like, but the fact, like, the ways that the connections play out and using the connections between them and where each of the characters are and where the connections get revealed it feels a little bit like an orchestra where there's all these different instruments playing, but now we have a little bit more string heavy, and now there's a little bit more brass over here, and now there's a quieter bit with the woodwinds. That's kind of what is evoked to me with the way this movie is using all these different pieces.
I 100% agree with that. Like the construction of the movie is, like you said, like an orchestra. It is very, very well put together.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't entertain or
Yeah, I can see that. Like,
not. I don't want to say entertain. Like I
sure.
need to be like
Oh
I'm
yeah.
not like I don't even watch Marvel movies. Like I like I'm not like
Mm-hmm.
it's not like I need that, right?
Sure,
Like
sure, sure. Yeah, no, I get that. I think like I was saying earlier, like I think what the movie is ultimately about, thematically, and I'm not saying that you don't get this or that there's any confusion about this. It's just that it's about all of these different characters experiencing vulnerability and the different ways that they have of trying to cope with that, and the ways they try to protect themselves from that, and the way that this happens from generation to generation in ways that there's the theme of the sins of the fathers are bestowed upon the children and so on, and like that's again where like obviously there's a rain of frogs towards the end, and it could be seen as coming out of nowhere, but thematically that's kind of what we're talking about, right? Like I think functionally in the storytelling, what's happening with that Reign of Frogs is it is the crisis moment that forces all of these characters to stop for a moment and then actually look around them at the world and what's actually happening in the moment around them, instead of just being in their own head and their own issues.
Right.
And so functionally in the storytelling, that's what's happening. Thematically, it's one of the curses of, it's like the plagues is what I mean. The idea of the sins of the fathers, like the whole biblical element of Reign of Frogs. It's like that's kind of what's happening there. But ultimately, the premise alongside these themes of vulnerability are these themes of connection and coincidence that, what are coincidences really? Are they more than that? Is there some sort of element of fate to it? And that's part of the analysis. One of the things it's maybe worth talking about a little bit, I don't know what you think about it, is that I think that the opening sequence is really interesting, where we have Ricky Jay narrating these three stories.
The legends.
Yeah. These three stories of incredible coincidence. There's the one where these three guys mugged someone on a street named Greenberry Hill, or a neighborhood called Greenberry Hill, and by coincidence, the three guys, their last names were Greenberry and Hill. And then there's one where the urban legend of the scuba diver in the tree gets scooped up by the firefighter plane. And then there's another one about a guy who is trying to kill himself by jumping off a building, but he gets shot through one of the windows on the way down. And there's a whole bit there.
I mean, it's a complicated bit.
There's even more to it.
He was shot by his parents who were arguing.
Right. And they didn't know the gun was loaded, but he was the one that loaded it.
He was the one that loaded the gun because he wanted them to kill themselves.
And then then there was a net at the bottom so that if he had not been shot on the way down, he would not have died from jumping off the building.
Right.
But
so, was technically suicide because
he was noted as an accomplice in his own death.
An accomplice in his own murder. Yeah, that's right.
But in any case, though, one of the things that I think, I love the opening sequence just in terms of establishing mood, because it's not just stories about coincidence. It's coincidences in terrible things happening, right? Because the other piece that we didn't mention of the scuba diver bit is the idea that the pilot of that plane had an altercation with that guy earlier that week. And then by sheer coincidence happened to be the pilot of the plane that picked him up. But the other piece of that is, when we talk about the film as opposed to the story in there, is that the film presents these as real coincidences, but they are in fact made up. They're not real stories, or rather, they are real stories. They are not facts about actual things that happened.
Right.
Like the last one about the guy jumping off the building was explicitly intended as. It was a speech given at like a criminology convention where he was trying to contrive a situation where the legal elements of it are as murky as possible, right? So that's where that came from. And then the scuba diver thing was always an urban legend. Just as soon as somebody thought of the idea of like, hey, look at those planes that pick up water. What if this happened? That's all that comes from. But so I think it's interesting given. What the movie ultimately does with these ideas of coincidence, though, is it all kind of comes back around when we get to the Reign of Frogs, right? Because it's all kind of crystallized when we have little Stanley, the kid in the present day who is on the game show, and he's broken into his school library after the whole incident that he had recording the show that day. And he is just marveling out the window at this Reign of Frogs and saying, this is something that happens. And in some ways it could be a really trite line, like he's not even saying anything. He's just, but what has struck me about that line and has actually been something I've thought a lot about almost separately from the movie since then, is just this recognition of common humanity, in the sense of so often we get so caught up in the specific details of whatever our own life is. Everything seems so unique and specific to you that sometimes what you need is to be able to take a moment and step outside yourself and say, this is something that happens, not just to you. Even if it's something unusual, it's something that happens. It's, the Reign of Frogs. He is someone who is an expert in trivia. That's been his whole thing, right? That he is on this game show as a kid, and the idea that people think it's funny that he knows all these weird little things. But he is exactly the person to know and marvel at this Reign of Frogs and know that, like, for him, this is not some surreal nightmare of how could this happen. He's someone that says, this is unusual, but it is something that happens, and I am getting to experience it here. It's not something happening to him. It is a thing that happens sometimes. This is something that happens. And like, it's in some ways very simple, but in the ability of that line to kind of get out of your own way for a moment and observe it, observe the world in that context, gives you a connection to all the other people who have ever experienced that. Does that make any sense? I feel like a little bit like
Yes.
I'm talking.
No,
Okay.
I was just going to let you talk because
Mm-hmm.
you were very passionate about it, but I agree. That's my favorite line in the whole movie too. That sequence that's the best part of the, like I said, the best part of the movie for me, because like you said, you've got this guy who's so involved in things that happen to people and happened in things that what he was never a part of.
Mm-hmm.
That once something interesting happens, and I think you said it better. I was going to say something interesting happens to him, but you're right. It doesn't happen to him. It happens, and he happens to be around it, but it's happening to everyone.
Right.
And so, but he is a part of it.
Yeah.
And the marvel that he shows in being like, to remove himself from that trap of like, this is my life, and like I learn these things and I spit them out, and then if I don't do it, if I have to go to the bathroom, then I'm letting all these people down, right? And it's embarrassing, and this, all the things that happen with that. But this is something that's happening that I am a part of. I don't control. No one else controls. And it's okay. Like, it's just, it's odd, but I'm here for it. Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, so yes, I was letting you talk because you were kind of getting to your thoughts on it.
Sure.
But I agree. It's that is kind of the summation of the movie right there. Like, so
yeah.
Yes, I get it. And I love that part of it.
Well, it's the climax for sure. Everything after
Yeah.
that is denouement,
Yeah.
It's the other
55 minutes that I have to put up. No, I'm kidding.
What?
I said that part is great, but it's the other 2 hours and 55 minutes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, but like, I think, like, certainly all of the different storylines work better or worse for various reasons. Like, because we certainly have Stanley, who we've talked about a little bit, who is on this game show where kids compete against adults, but he's had the whole bit where, like, he has to pee, and then the adults, nobody's listening to him, and he ends up having to, like, he pees his pants there on this live TV set because no one will let him go, right? And
it gets like the final competition where you have to go head to head and get out of your seat, and he refuses because he peed himself. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then not only, like, you just have how monstrous that one lady is, who, like, she acts all nice and friendly, but the instant the kid is inconvenient, then, and then, of course, like, once she knows exactly what has happened, but it's like, what's his problem? She's like, I have no idea. Because, of course, she was the one that knew there was a problem before it happened and didn't do anything about it. And, in fact, specifically told him not to go. You know, you told him, no, you can't go now. She told him twice, two previous occasions, like even when there was a break. And she said, no, you have to wait until the next commercial break. But in any case, so we have him. We also have William H. Macy's character, who used to be on that same show 30 years ago. And he's the guy that I mentioned briefly that, he has his whole thing where he's got a crush on this bartender who has braces, and he's kind of talked himself into the idea that maybe if he also got braces, it would be like a thing in common, and maybe that would be what would let them get in a relationship. But his life is just kind of falling apart because he's distracted all the time. There's a great sequence where Alfred Molina is playing his boss, and there's a whole bit of he's always late for work. He's distracted. He's getting fired, and he was going to ask for money as a loan, but he's like, I lent you my celebrity, I lent you my name, and he's like, I paid you for that. You got a paycheck. That's the part of my responsibility, and I fulfilled it. You're the one that's not doing your part.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's fun. But he is just really struggling, and so he gets fired, and then he goes to this bar where the bartender works, and he doesn't know how to approach him. But then he goes into kind of a panic when he realizes that Henry Gibson is there at the bar, also flirting with that same bartender, but he's got money, and he's getting the bartender's attention for that reason. And so he just starts getting drunk, and then there's a lot of just conversation there. But and so I guess I'm just kind of briefly listing the main plot lines, right? So we've also got Jason Robards, who's dying of cancer. He was a big TV producer, and so Julianne Moore is his much younger wife, who has many problems of her own, not least the fact that her husband is dying of cancer, and she's got her whole thing. There's the live-in nurse, who played by Phillip Seymour Hoffman, who is just wonderful in this movie. He was so great. Phillip Seymour Hoffman was so great. It's such a tragedy that he died so young. And in a lot of ways, I think he is probably the least flawed character in the movie. Wouldn't you say? What do you think?
Yeah.
Because he's kind of just the pure empathy and compassion without really having any ulterior motive.
Yeah, and they don't dive into like any of his background, or like they don't try to connect him any deeper than just that he's the nurse, right? Like,
right, yeah.
Anybody else is like woven in a little more, right? So
yeah. So, but at the same time, he doesn't feel like a plot mechanic. He feels like a person. He's a really good person. And like, thank God there's people like that in the world who are willing to do such an incredibly hard job in terms of, emotional labor, to be the person can be there to take care of people who are dying like that, hospice nurse, like that's an admirable job, because you can imagine a lot of people are not going to be very well suited for that. So, and then you also have Tom Cruise, which we can get to, playing Jason Robards' estranged son, but also the guy responsible for the seduce and destroy system, which is basically kind of like a pickup artist, the game sort of thing, like womanizing, like how to manipulate women into having sex with you, that sort of thing. And he's like the like a motivational speaker that is conning desperate guys into paying him lots of money to tell them how to pick up women, right?
It's kind of an amazing like setup and performance, because it's done using all the techniques that good motivational like speakers, like anybody, I mean, a Tony Robbins or any kind of business coach, like any of those guys, but just done with this like salacious, like weird motive. Well, and but he treat like his disassociation with it is like really kind of weird. Like he's treating it the same way as like how to market your business, but like how to go take advantage of tons of girls, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like in his mind, it's like, or his performance at least, it's the same. Like,
Well, yeah. So like it kind of gets into like the part of what I was saying earlier in terms of these themes of vulnerability and what we do to try to protect ourselves, right? Because his plot line, like if you follow just his scenes, like we see him do the opening session of this workshop that he's doing where he is just all out there, right? He is, you know, lewd and salacious, but he is very much in the zone of you can see why desperate guys are paying him money to, you know, they believe that he will help them do
yeah,
this. You know, like just doing things like how to turn that friend into your sex starved servant, like that sort of thing, right? Like it's extremely gross, but obviously from the purposes of the movie, on purpose. We are supposed to think that, right? But then in between, like over the lunch of this workshop, he is getting interviewed by this woman for TV, and we watch the interview taking place. But it becomes clear as the interview progresses that she has actually done a lot of research into the fact that most of what he says is true about his life is actually lies. And she has looked up the actual details, and it's a gotcha interview where she's going to basically call him on it, where he says, "Oh, well, my father died, but my mom, you know, she's like, well, what does your mom think about this?" It's like, "Oh," she says, "you go get him, honey." And then she's like, "Oh, well, you know, I have it here that you're actually your mom died of cancer and you had to take care of her while she was sick, and then you were raised by this other woman after that." And he's just like, "That's what you heard." It's like, "Oh, and your dad isn't dead. He's this guy." And and starts just calling him on all of this stuff. Like, you know, it's like, you know, it's your name isn't actually Frank Mackey, is it? And there's like, "Oh, well, no, it's Mackey's actually, you know, my mother's father's name." "Yeah, and Frank." And he's just calling him on how every single piece of his public persona is bullshit. And you watch him, and it's an incredible performance because you watch Tom Cruise showing us Frank Mackey getting increasingly terrified even as he tries to maintain the image.
yep.
But you can see it in his eyes. It's like, "Oh shit. This she knows this stuff. What is she doing?" And it's not even just a matter of being called on lies that he's afraid of. She's making him think about stuff that he doesn't like to think about. That's why he made up the lies, is because he doesn't like thinking about what's the truth.
That's what I was going to say. The lies aren't there for any sort of like marketing purpose. Like
Right.
the lies are there because he doesn't want to deal with that part of himself.
Yeah,
Right.
he's you mentioned dissociation earlier.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. He has invented a new person to be that does not have the vulnerabilities that he feels when he's himself. And he leans so hard into being that person. But then when she's bringing up these details, it's forcing him to confront those things that he doesn't like to think about. And there's the whole bit where it's such a good line of he eventually just stops answering her questions at all, just staring at her, and she's like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "I'm silently judging you." And it feels just so petty and childish. It, like, you can imagine he's wanting it to feel superior and like condescending, but it doesn't at all. It feels like panic and sulking and like, "I don't know what to do, so I'm just going to stop talking." You know, like, but you can see both of those pieces in his performance. It's great, right? But then, of course, the last act for him is that he gets the call that tells him your estranged father has been dying and now is actually going to die, like it's imminent. And so he goes over there to have his last conversation. But by sheer coincidence, he arrives just as he's been given the liquid morphine that's basically going to have him not really conscious anymore until the end. And it's just, again, it's just the timing of it is he arrives just as they have decided to make that call. And so he is having to have this conversation with his father, who is not able to respond. But then, of course, as we mentioned, what the frogs do in the story is the frogs are loud enough and startling enough that it just for a moment wakes up the father enough that they can share a moment of eye contact before he goes. And it's just like Tom Cruise, like at the bedside when, you can see him starting to cry, but he doesn't want to cry, and he's trying to stop himself from crying, and he's mad, but he, in the same way that William H. Macy talks about, I have lots of love to give, I don't know where to put it. This is what's happening with Tom Cruise here, is not so much that it's love as much as like he's got all of this emotion, but he doesn't know how to process it. His coping mechanisms have turned out to be entirely destructive, because now that he's feeling real things, he doesn't know how to do it. So he's really struggling there. And then of course we get the whole payoff with him, which is, in our denouement, he is the one that's there at the house when the hospital calls, because Julianne Moore tried to kill herself with an overdose. And so he's the one that goes to the hospital. And so, like, now there is a connection there. Like, he didn't even know her name before. And she was the one that slapped Phillip Seymour Hoffman in the face for presuming to call Frank, even though he had been asked to. But now we can imagine that maybe those two will be able to have some kind of a connection, and there's something that's been formed, and it feels like growth. Despite everything that those two characters have as a history, I think we're left with the feeling that there's an improvement there. Perhaps both of them will be better off for having this connection.
Yes.
We also have John C. Reilly as Officer Jim Curring, and Melora Walters as the daughter of the host of the game show, who, like, what a weird dynamic those two have, right? Because I think it's deliberately played for humor, although they don't really signpost it or anything, how ridiculously inappropriate and probably like ill-advised for the two of them to be flirting and then actually go on a date. It's just like, from both directions, you just sort of feel like if they had anyone else in their life to shake them by their lapels and tell them, what the fuck are you doing? Because, like, even, he's a cop who has been called because someone's playing their music too loud, but strongly suspects this is a woman who's doing drugs, and he's right about that, who is having his own professional struggles as a police officer, is like, sure, maybe let's ask this woman that I've come to her house under this context for a date. And then she's in the position of saying, oh God, I have cocaine in the other room. And he thinks he knows it, but then at the same time, part of what is causing the deeper connection there, and kind of in some ways his excuse to stay around a little longer, and part of what I think it draws him to her, is the fact that, we learn later that she was molested by her dad. And that was why when he came by earlier, she didn't want to talk to him. She screamed at him. That was part of why he was called out to the house, right? And so his assumption is that she's got like an abusive boyfriend or something, right? And he is sensing that that's where her fear is coming from. And he is feeling a protective urge as a result, right? And I think that's part of what's going on there. Whereas for her, she is, of course, afraid, like, oh God, I could get in trouble here. It would be best for me if he would just leave. But I think it's also been a long time since she felt someone, like she was with someone in a room where she actually sensed a sincere desire to protect her and help her be safe. And to be nice and kind to her. Like, we can imagine that, like, her, like, obviously with her dad, it's a complicated thing there because he's trying to say nice and pleasing things, but we also know that there's a bad history there. And I think probably she doesn't feel safe with her mom because her mom doesn't know and probably would, we don't know exactly how that played out, right? Because she clearly maybe wondered, but didn't ever have proof and didn't seem to believe it until he admits it later, right? But so the two of them together is such a weird dynamic that it like everything about it on paper feels like a terrible, terrible idea. And yet I feel like the chemistry of it is so weird, and yet you, at least for me, I kind of feel like there is no point in the movie where it feels like a good idea, and yet I believe why both of the characters still continue to make the decisions they do.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it is, yeah, the whole thing is super awkward, and I mean, on purpose, but
Mm-hmm.
like just the idea that like you think that she's not gonna go, and then you think she's excited to go, and then
Mm-hmm.
she's excited to go, but only if she does a bunch of coke first.
Well, right,
Like
because like yeah,
she's bought that, not that she bought that credibility, but like the movie, like that's the character,
yeah, well,
right?
because we see her trying to resist the temptation to do the coke, and then doing it anyway.
Right.
But we can understand in terms of the psychology of what's going on here. Like even before we know that that's what went on with her dad, I think we can kind of guess that it might have been something like that. But we can understand that where she is feeling like I'm damaged goods. Why would anyone normal ever want me? Right? And so the idea that this guy who seems normal and like he's got all his shit together, like why the idea that he would be interested is something that she longs for, even as she thinks she maybe doesn't deserve it. Right? Whereas for him, like that energy at the restaurant prompts him to confess to her his most deep, dark fear, which is I'm not actually very good at my job. I lost my gun today. People don't respect me. Even when I do manage to accomplish something, everybody just ignores me. Like the whole thing with his, encounter earlier, where like his instinct is right in the sense that there was actually a body in the apartment that that he discovers, but he does not seem like he has the situation under control. And then even later, when everyone else shows up, they're not even really listening to him, right? And so for him to see her comparing herself to him in that way and having talking about like not keeping the secrets prompts him to make this confession of not being good at his job. And I think it's that like even beyond any question of whether the two of them would go on to have a healthy relationship, probably not. I mean, but at the same time, they can be people who are kind to each other in a moment of crisis without necessarily needing to go on to have a long-term relationship, right? Because it is that same moment of being able to express his vulnerability that is, I think, what leads him to make the decision he does later, which is he sees William H. Macy trying to what he thinks is rob the store. It turns out he's actually trying to get back into the store because he's already taken the money and now he regrets it. And he's trying to climb up the side of the building because he can't get back in as a whole thing. But in any case, just as the frogs hit, he has just observed him trying to get into this building. But then what does he decide to do? Does he decide to arrest him? No. He talks things through with them and then helps him go in and put the money back and then lets him go. And I think that we can imagine that his cop friends, or cop colleagues, because we imagine he doesn't have a lot of friends, probably would not have made the same call there, right? But I think it was that moment of him having experienced that feeling of being able to unburden himself of some of those fears and express those vulnerabilities that allowed him to find compassion to treat William H. Macy the way he does. And then I think the only main character we haven't really talked about in detail is just we have the host of the game show, Claudia's father, who is dying of cancer in his own right, and he is like he's kind of the opposite in some respects to the Phillip Seymour Hoffman character in the sense that he's mostly really kind of just doing his own thing for selfish reasons and doesn't end up really getting redeemed. You know, he like he's trying to do this game show, but it's all paint by numbers at this point. He doesn't really know what to do. He talks about having like less than 2 months, but he doesn't know how to not just keep doing this show that he's done for so long. He's barely telling anybody. When he does, he's only starting to tell people when he's literally starting to not be able to do the job because, you know, he's having trouble breathing on set and stuff like that. But he is all just, it's all still about what's going on with him. Even wanting to try to repair his relationship with his daughter, there's no element of like, here's what I actually did. It's all still about pretending that this is all just normal and you should just get over it. And you're the one that's being crazy by screaming at me when all I'm trying to do is talk to you. Right? You know, and then when he goes back and he's talking to his wife and he decides to apologize for cheating on her. But at the same time, like, even as he's giving this whole speech, like, I'm not saying that he is entirely he's not a monster. He is a human being who has done a lot of bad stuff and is pretty selfish in ways that human beings tend to be, right? I'm not saying he's not like just a like dark shadow of an individual, but you can see him recognizing, even as he's giving this speech, you can see him kind of recognizing that he is confessing here, not because he thinks that will help her, but because he wants to get it off his chest. And he is hoping that it will also make her feel better, but he doesn't stop talking. You know, and then, but even then, he doesn't say what was really going on with Claudia, and she finally kind of picks up on that. It's like he's unburdening himself, but still keeping something. And also, I know that our daughter won't talk to him or even be in the same room with him. Maybe this is where he'll finally admit something. But even then, like the whole dynamic of, I don't remember. Like she thinks that I may have molested her, and implying that maybe like he was too drunk or something, like he doesn't remember for sure. And I'm inclined to think that it's possible that that's true, that he doesn't really remember, whether it's because he was drunk or whether it's kind of like what we talked about with Tom Cruise, where it's just like he knows he shouldn't have and therefore works really hard to never think about it.
Yep.
Alternately, it could also just be he knows that's the thing that would make his wife actually leave, which of course it does. Because, you know, when he finally says, I don't know what I've done, she's like, you should know better. That should not be the sort of thing that is left ambiguous. If you don't know for certain that you have not molested our daughter, that's enough to be a deal breaker. You need to be able to know that for sure. And so she leaves, and then, of course, you know, it's interesting because, like, of all of the people who get dealt with by the frogs, his is perhaps the strangest in the sense that he seems about to shoot himself and the frog stops him, but then also ends up causing a fire that presumably burns the house down and kills him that way. So it's weird in the sense that it doesn't necessarily change the outcome, except that it removes his agency from the situation.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I think the only other person that gets something else a little bit weirder for the frogs is that it apparently returns John C. Reilly's gun to him. Which is, again, that's the one, like, I like that there is, on the face of it, an idea that the Reign of Frogs is that this is something that happens, but there are some of these just little tiny grace notes that feel more explicitly magical. Like there's the other bit about the little kid who raps and says, "Come off it, I'm a prophet," as one of the lines, and does seem to have some sort of a weird, like, mystical function in the story, even if it's not explicit. You know, like his last appearance is when he shows up and he's the one that finds Julianne Moore before she dies of her overdose.
Right.
And I like the detail that he gets into the car and takes the money out of her wallet before he calls 911. But anyway, I've talked a lot about this, obviously, because it's one of my favorite movies. But I think it's great. But I think it's also interesting, in back to the context of Tom Cruise, that he was willing to play this role that has so many really overtly negative qualities that are not really redeemed so much as we understand them a bit better, right? Because we can maybe understand that he is a deeply hurt person who is doing these things out of psychology rather than evil, but it doesn't make them great, you know?
No.
There are plenty of people who also had neglectful fathers who don't become pickup artists, right?
Correct.
But in any case, so Tom Cruise's willingness at this stage, I think this plus Eyes Wide Shut is where he starts looking around at saying, like, who are some of these big, fancy art directors that I would like to work with? So, you know, we have, Stanley Kubrick, obviously, and then for this we have Paul Thomas Anderson, who is fresh off of Boogie Nights. I'm trying to remember which.
Boogie Nights was before this, yeah.
Well, I know it was before this. I was trying to remember if there was something else in between.
I think so.
I can find that out in a moment. But yeah, it does seem to be part of his new drive there. Let's see. As a director, yeah, Boogie Nights was the only other big one before this. Well, I mean, Hard 8 was before Boogie Nights, but I mean, there wasn't anything in between. But certainly, Boogie Nights attracted a lot of attention, so he was known for that reason. But yeah, so certainly we have Tom Cruise starting to simultaneously kind of two-prong his career. He is action guy in Mission Impossible, right? Because Mission Impossible 2 comes out the next year. And then also trying to work with the, higher profile directors. But I think it is actually in the next couple of movies that we're going to talk about next time that he really begins kind of the new phase in his career where he becomes not just action guy, but like sci-fi genre action guy.
Yep.
But we'll talk about that more in the future. When we talk about we wrap up our Tom Cruise series, we decided we were going to discuss in detail Minority Report, Collateral, and American Made. And obviously that'll all be in context of the movies he's made since then. And that's where we will pick up. And so I guess any other closing thoughts?
No, look forward to those ones. It'll be good.
All right. So with that done, thank you everybody for listening and or watching. And we will return with more Tom Cruise movies later. And in the meantime, watch good movies.